My mother told me 3 days before my wedding that my fiancé was an embarrassment to our family name. Not a bad person. Not wrong for me. An embarrassment. She said it the way she said everything. Quietly, over her second glass of Pinot Grigio, like she was commenting on the weather. We were sitting in the kitchen of her house in Naperville, Illinois. The kitchen she'd redone twice in 10 years because the marble wasn't quite right the first time, and then wasn't quite right the second time either. My mother has a very particular taste. Always has. I grew up understanding that certain things were acceptable and certain things were not, and a line between them was something you were just supposed to know without being told. I didn't always know. That was my problem, apparently. His name is Derek Kowalski. He's 31 years old, originally from Rockford, and he owns a plumbing and pipe-fitting business that he built from nothing starting at age 24. He has calluses on his hands and he laughs too loud at his own jokes. And he once drove 2 hours in a snowstorm to fix a burst pipe for an elderly woman who couldn't afford the emergency rate. He didn't charge her. He didn't tell me about it either. I found out from her daughter, who tracked down our number to say thank you. That's the man my mother called an embarrassment. I want to be clear about what she actually said, because when I've told this story before, people assume she screamed at me or gave some dramatic ultimatum. She didn't. My mother doesn't scream. She said, very calmly, I just don't understand what you two have in common, sweetheart. You have a master's degree. He fixes pipes. And then she took another sip of her wine. I told her Derek had built a business with 11 employees and contracts with 3 commercial property management companies in the greater Chicago area. She nodded slowly, the way she does when she's decided not to argue but also hasn't changed her mind. Your father would like to talk to you before Saturday, she said. That was Thursday. The wedding was Saturday morning. I should tell you about my father. My father is a retired federal judge. 31 years on the bench, the last 9 in the 7th Circuit. In our town, in our family's social world, he is the kind of man people stand up slightly straighter around. He has the kind of presence that takes up a room without him trying. Growing up, I thought every father was like that. It took me until college to realize that most people's dads just came home from work, ate dinner, watched TV. Mine came home and held court. He was not cruel. I want to say that clearly. He was not a cruel father. He was demanding and exacting, and he had opinions about everything, my grades, my friends, my clothes, my choices. But he was also the person who taught me to read using the newspaper when I was 4 years old, who took me to every science museum within driving distance because I went through a phase of wanting to be a marine biologist, who showed up to every single one of my swim meets even during the years when he was traveling for work 4 days a week. I loved my father. Love my father. That matters for the rest of this. He called me Friday morning, the day before the wedding. I was at the hotel in downtown Chicago, where we'd gotten a block of rooms for out-of-town guests. Sitting on the edge of the bed in my pajamas eating a granola bar. When he called, I need you to come by the house, he said. I told him I had the rehearsal dinner that evening and a million things to get done before then. This won't take long, he said. Come at noon. My father has always been better at giving instructions than requests. I went at noon. He was in his study when I got there. Books floor to ceiling, the big mahogany desk he'd had since before I was born, a window looking out onto the backyard where my mother's garden was just starting to come in for spring. He was standing at the window when I walked in, which I remember thinking was strange. My father is a man who sits, who waits. Standing at a window felt unlike him. He turned around and said, I'm not going to walk you down the aisle tomorrow. I thought I'd misheard him. I actually said, what? Derek is not the right match for you. I've said this before and you've chosen not to hear me. I'm not going to stand at that altar and give you away to a man I don't respect. I sat down in the chair across from his desk because my legs felt strange. The granola bar I'd eaten for breakfast was doing something unpleasant in my stomach. Dad, I said, the wedding is tomorrow. There are 160 people coming. I'm aware of that. You're serious. I don't say things I don't mean. That's true. He never has. I don't remember exactly what I said for the next few minutes. I know I cried, which I didn't want to do, and I know I tried to argue, and I know none of it moved him. He stood there with his arms crossed and his face set in that expression I'd known my whole life, the one that meant the decision had already been made, that we were now just in the administrative phase of him informing me of it. Before I left, I said, "I'm marrying him tomorrow whether you're there or not." My father said, "I know." I drove back to the hotel and called Derek and cried on the phone for 20 minutes. Derek said, "Okay, it's going to be okay. Do you want me to come over?" I said no. I said I needed to think. I said I couldn't believe this was happening the day before our wedding. Derek said, "Your dad loves you. He's wrong about this, but he loves you. Let's just get married and figure out the rest later." That's Derek. That's exactly Derek. I barely slept Friday night. I lay in the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about walking down that aisle alone, thinking about what I would say to my aunt and my cousins and my grandmother when they asked where my father was, thinking about the photographs, thinking about the fact that in less than 18 hours I was supposed to be starting my marriage, and instead I was lying here in the dark, feeling like something had been broken. At some point around 3 a.m., I got up and sat by the window and looked out at the city, and I thought about my grandmother. My father's mother. I called her Grandma Bay. She died when I was 11, and I still miss her in that way. You miss someone who shaped you before you were old enough to know they were shaping you. She used to make me peppermint tea when I was sick. She had this old sewing box with a broken latch that she'd fixed with a rubber band, and she kept it on the windowsill in her apartment in Evanston. And sometimes she'd open it and let me touch all the spools and buttons, and I thought it was the most interesting thing in the world. I thought about Grandma Bay because thinking about her always calmed me down, and eventually I fell asleep. The morning of my wedding, I woke up at 7, and my maid of honor, my cousin Trish, was already there with coffee and bagels from the place down the street. She had run interference with my mother the day before and spent 20 minutes trying to talk my father into coming and gotten exactly nowhere. She handed me a coffee and said, "You look terrible," and I laughed, and that helped. We did the hair and makeup. My dress was simple, cream, fitted through the bodice with a small train. I had spent 8 months looking for it, and I loved it completely, and I had imagined, the whole time I was looking, my father's face when he saw me in it. I kept not thinking about that. The ceremony was at a small historic chapel in the city, the kind with dark wood pews and good acoustics and tall windows that let in northern light. Derek and I had visited it together, had liked immediately that it felt old and real and not like a movie set. We had 160 guests coming. Derek's family took up about half the church, his parents, his 2 brothers, assorted aunts and uncles, cousins, guys from his crew who cleaned up well and laughed easily. My side was my mother, who had, in the end, come, stone-faced but present. Trish, my aunt and her husband, a few cousins, colleagues from the hospital where I work as an occupational therapist, some college friends. My father's seat was in the front row. I had not called him that morning to find out if he'd changed his mind. I couldn't. At 11:40, 20 minutes before the ceremony, I was in the small room off the vestibule that the chapel calls the bridal suite. It is a modest room, a love seat, an old mirror, a window looking onto a side street. Trish had gone to check on something. I was alone for the first time all morning, and I was standing in front of the mirror in my dress, looking at myself and trying to decide if I was happy or terrified or both. Then one of the chapel's coordinators knocked. She opened the door and said, "I'm so sorry to bother you. There's a gentleman here. He says he's family." She paused. "He's in a wheelchair. He says he's been waiting a long time to do this. He seems to know you pretty well. He knew your middle name." I don't know why that detail hit me the way it did. My middle name is Frances. It was Grandma Bay's name. Almost no one knows it. I don't use it. It's not on any program or any invitation. I said, "Send him in." I expected I don't know what. A distant relative, someone's grandfather, come to the wrong room. The coordinator pushed the door open wider, and a man in a wheelchair came through. He was old. 80, maybe older. Thin, with white hair and blue eyes that were sharp and alert in a way that felt disconnected from how frail the rest of him seemed. He was wearing a suit that had been carefully pressed. He was holding a small bundle of flowers, lily of the valley, tied with a piece of ribbon, in his lap. He looked at me and his eyes went very bright and he said, "You look like your grandmother." My grandmother. On my father's side, Grandma Bea. I said, "I'm sorry, who are you?" He said, "I'm your great-uncle Ray, your grandfather Harold's youngest brother." He paused. "I don't suppose your father ever mentioned me." He had not. I sat down on the love seat because my legs were doing the thing again. I looked at this old man in his pressed suit holding Lily of the Valley in his lap, and I said, "I don't understand." So he told me. Ray Cosman, that's his name, my grandmother's brother-in-law, had been, for most of his adult life, the person my grandfather Harold trusted most. They were close. Harold had 3 children, my father, my Aunt Patricia, and a younger son who died as a child. When Harold got older and his health started declining, he set up a trust. The trust was substantial. Harold had been careful with money his entire life, had owned property in Evanston that appreciated considerably, had investments that had done well. The trust was meant to be divided among his children after he was gone, with some set aside for grandchildren's education. My father is a lawyer. A federal judge is, before anything else, a lawyer. Harold trusted his eldest son to administer the trust. What actually happened, Ray told me, was that my father had rearranged things. Over the course of several years, while Harold was still alive but no longer sharp enough to closely monitor his own finances, my father had shifted assets, changed beneficiary designations, restructured accounts. By the time Harold died, 11 years ago, the trust had been administered in a way that left my Aunt Patricia with considerably less than she should have received, and left nothing for any grandchildren's education, and was structured in a way that, if you didn't know what you were looking for, looked completely legal and correct. My Aunt Patricia had hired an attorney. The attorney had told her it would be difficult to prove. She had spent years trying. Ray had known about this for a long time. He had tried, he said, to talk to my father. My father had stopped returning his calls. Eventually, Ray had been effectively cut off from the family. Not dramatically, not with a confrontation, just slowly, quietly, the way my father does everything. Invitations stopped coming. His calls went unreturned. When I was growing up, I had never once heard my great-uncle Ray mentioned. I was 31 years old and I was meeting this man for the first time in my life in a bridal room 20 minutes before my wedding. I said, "How did you know about the wedding?" He said, "Patricia told me." My aunt, my father's sister, who I see twice a year at holidays, and who has always been a little quieter around my father than seems natural. I sat with this for a moment. I looked at this old man in his wheelchair, and I thought about my father standing at his study window, telling me he wasn't coming. I thought about Grandma Bea's sewing box. I thought about Harold, my grandfather, who died when I was 20, and who I had loved and who I thought I had known. I said, "Why did you come today?" Ray said, "Because I've been watching your father keep you from people who love you your whole life, and I'm too old to let it happen one more time." He paused. "Also," I thought, "if you'd let me, I would like to walk you down that aisle." I started crying. Full, proper crying, the kind Trish was going to be annoyed about because of the makeup situation. I said yes. We had to make some adjustments. The coordinator found a way to manage the wheelchair and the aisle carpet. Trish, who had come back to find me and Ray deep in conversation and had stood in the doorway for a moment reading the room, handled everything with the efficiency she applies to all logistical challenges. My mother, seated in the front pew, saw me appear at the back of the church with an old man in a wheelchair she didn't recognize, and had a very complicated expression on her face that I would describe as distress attempting to impersonate composure. Derek saw me and his face did the thing I love, the thing where the rest of it just goes quiet and he looks at me like I'm the only thing in the room. Then he looked at Ray, and he leaned over and whispered something to his best man, and his best man nodded and stepped down from the platform and came and walked alongside Ray's wheelchair down the aisle. Derek had never met Ray. Derek had met him for the first time from across a church in that moment, and he had just quietly decided that this old man who had made it to the wedding should not have to navigate an aisle alone. I thought, watching that I was going to be okay, that we were going to be okay, The ceremony was the best hour of my life. Afterward, at the reception, I found my Aunt Patricia at the bar and we talked for a long time. She told me what she knew, more than Ray had been able to get through in 20 minutes. She told me that she'd been fighting this quietly for years, and that the legal path was complicated and expensive, and so far her attorney hadn't found the clean opening they needed. She told me she was sorry she hadn't found a way to tell me sooner. I told her not to be sorry. I told her I wanted to help. A week after the wedding, Derek and I had dinner with Patricia and her husband in their house in Oak Park. By the end of dinner, we had agreed that I would be added to the legal action as a party. My father had administered a trust that affected my inheritance too. What should have come to me for education had disappeared the same way Patricia's share had. Our attorney, Patricia's attorney, now mine too, a woman named Geneva Wright, who specializes in estate litigation and who has the most organized mind I have ever encountered, spent the next 4 months building the case. This is the part of the story that people always want to know about, so I'll tell you as clearly as I can. The case rested on a paper trail. My father is meticulous, but meticulousness leaves records. Geneva found 3 specific transactions, each individually defensible, that together formed a pattern that was much harder to explain. She also located a financial advisor my grandfather had used, who had notes, actual handwritten notes, from a meeting in which Harold had specified his wishes for the trust distribution. Those notes were not reflected in what my father had done. My father has resources. He handed me an older. The case took time. 8 months after Derek and I got married, my father agreed to a settlement. I can't tell you the exact terms because the agreement has a confidentiality provision, but I can tell you that Patricia received a payment that was meaningful and that my father's professional reputation took a significant blow in a community where reputation is, essentially, everything. He was not criminally charged. Civil settlements are different from criminal cases, but a formal complaint was filed with the state bar, and the investigation that resulted was not resolved in a way that added anything to his legacy. My father graduated. He handed me and old him a luxury apartment. This is the part that's hard to explain to people, because everyone assumes I hate him. I don't. I've tried to work out what I do feel, and the closest I can get is grief. I grieve the father I thought I had. I grieve the family I thought we were. I grieve the version of Saturday mornings in his study doing the crossword together that I now understand was built on a foundation that wasn't solid. I don't regret pursuing the case. I don't regret marrying Derek. I don't regret any of it. Derek's business now has 16 employees. They took on 2 major commercial contracts last year, and he's starting to think about opening a second location in the south suburbs. He still sometimes drives out of his way to help customers he knows can't afford the going rate. He still laughs too loud at his own jokes. He still makes me feel like the only thing in the room. Ray came to our first anniversary dinner. He and Derek spent most of the evening talking about the Cubs, which Ray has followed since 1962, and Derek follows the way you follow a team that keeps disappointing you, but you keep showing up anyway. I sat across the table watching them and thought about the fact that, if my father had gotten what he wanted, if he'd succeeded in keeping me from the wrong people, the not good enough people, the people who didn't fit his picture, I would never have had this. I would never have had Derek. I would never have found Ray. Patricia and I would still be cordial strangers at Christmas. My father thought he was protecting something. His name, his idea of our family, some carefully maintained image of who we were and where we stood. He spent 30 years building a wall around that image, and I genuinely think, he believed he was doing it for us. That it was love in his understanding of love. But love doesn't cut people out. Love doesn't quietly rearrange a trust while your father is too old to stop you. Love doesn't stand at a window and tell your daughter, the day before her wedding, that the man she's chosen isn't worth showing up for. I know what love looks like now. It looks like an old man in a pressed suit holding Lily of the Valley in his lap, showing up to a wedding he wasn't invited to because he decided someone in this family was finally going to do the right thing. It looks like a groom who steps down from the altar to make sure a stranger in a wheelchair doesn't have to cross a room alone. I'm writing this on a Tuesday afternoon. Derek is out on a job in Joliet. Ray called this morning to tell me he found a documentary about the 1969 Cubs season, and did I think Derek would want to watch it with him on Sunday? I said yes, I think Derek would love that. The lily of the valley from my wedding bouquet, the piece I kept, the piece I pressed between the pages of a book, is still on my nightstand. Some things you keep. I've thought a lot about what my father actually believed he was doing, not to excuse it. I'm past the point where I'm trying to excuse it, but I think about it because I don't want to make the same mistake. The one where you become so certain that your judgment is correct that you stop noticing what it costs the people around you. My father spent his life building something, a name, a reputation, a particular image of who we were as a family, and I think he genuinely believed that protecting that image was the same thing as protecting us. That steering me away from Derek, keeping me inside the lines of what he considered acceptable. That was love, in his mind. He would have called it love without hesitating. But here's what I know now, after everything, love that controls isn't love. It's just control with better branding. What my father did to Patricia. The slow, careful rearrangement of Harold's trust while Harold was too old to catch it. That didn't happen because he was a monster. It happened because he had spent decades deciding that his judgment was superior, that he knew better, that the rules applied differently to him. One small compromise led to another. One rationalization opened the door for the next. By the time he was sitting across from his own sister watching her receive less than she was owed, I think he had told himself the story so many times that he actually believed it was fair. That's the thing about moral shortcuts. They don't announce themselves. They just quietly become the road you're on. And the people who paid for it weren't abstractions. It was Patricia, who spent years and real money fighting for what should have simply been hers. It was Ray, cut off from a family he loved because he knew too much and said so. It was me, growing up with a version of my grandfather that had been curated, edited, the inconvenient parts quietly removed. What I keep coming back to is Ray showing up anyway. He is in his 80s. He had every reason to stay home, to decide it wasn't his fight anymore, to let the wedding happen without him, and whatever came after, come after. Instead, he put on a pressed suit and had someone drive him to a chapel in the city, and he sat in a wheelchair in a bridal room holding Lily of the Valley. And he told me the truth. That took something. Not just courage, though it took that too, but a kind of stubborn commitment to doing right, even when doing right is inconvenient and late and possibly unwelcome. He didn't know how I would react. He didn't know if I would believe him or throw him out or call my father. He came anyway. And Derek, who had never met this man, who had only seen him from across a church, stepped down from the altar without being asked and made sure Ray didn't cross that aisle alone. I think about what my father was trying to build, and I think about what Derek actually is, and I understand now why my father felt threatened. Not because Derek was lesser. Because Derek made his priorities look exactly like what they were. You can spend your whole life building a wall around something that isn't worth protecting. Or you can spend it showing up, for the people who need it, at the inconvenient times, without waiting to be asked. My father chose the wall. Ray and Derek chose to show up. I know which one I want to spend my life next to.